In the fall of 1873, when the harvest had been good but the days grew short, Esther Lapp began preparing more than just food. She was preparing for winter, but what she didn't realize was that her humble practices would soon prove to be more than just tradition. They would be the one thing to save her family during a time of unimaginable hardship. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if stories of simple living, craftsmanship, and the quiet strength of faith speak to your heart, join us for tomorrow's tale. The early autumn chill had come with a bite, making Esther Lapp draw her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she surveyed the fields. The harvest had been abundant this year. The potatoes were plentiful, the carrots bright and firm, and the turnips round and healthy. But it wasn't just the bounty of the earth that filled her heart with satisfaction. It was the quiet rhythm of the work itself. It was the stillness that followed every season's harvest, the knowing that they would soon be preparing for the cold months ahead. Jacob, her husband, moved methodically beside her, gathering the last of the vegetables into baskets. The Lapp family had always prided themselves on their connection to the land and their simplicity, and this harvest was no different. They had worked together for hours, but there was no rush, no reason to hurry. Every vegetable, every fruit, and every jar of preserved goods they gathered was another thread in the tapestry of their survival. Their cabin, tucked beneath the rolling hills of Lancaster County, stood as a testament to the steady, methodical work that had kept them warm through winters long past. As the sun began to dip lower behind the trees, casting a warm golden glow across the land, Esther turned her attention to the task ahead. The cellar would need to be stocked. It would take the better part of the week to store everything, but Esther had no mind for haste. She could still hear the words her mother had spoken years ago as they packed their cellar together. When you store for the future, you do so with more than your hands. You use your heart. The words echoed in her mind as she moved to the barn, gathering the jars she had prepared over the past few weeks. Each jar of tomatoes, each root vegetable packed tightly in clay and stored carefully, was a piece of the future, a future they weren't sure they would survive without. The preserves and pickled vegetables would provide more than just sustenance. They would be a reminder of what their ancestors had done before them. Their simple ways, born from necessity and faith, were not just about food. They were about survival in the truest sense. Through respect, patience, and enduring through the seasons as they came, Esther's hands moved over the jars with precision, wiping each one clean before securing the lid. It was a quiet, meditative act. There was no rush. Her faith had always guided her in these moments, teaching her that the smallest act of devotion was often the one that brought the greatest reward. By the time Jacob joined her in the barn, the last of the jars was sealed and ready. He nodded in approval. "The cellar will be well stocked this year, Esther," he said, his voice steady and content. She smiled softly, but there was something more in her eyes. She didn't just feel the weight of the harvest or the work ahead. There was an intuitive knowing, a quiet certainty that what they had done, the time they had taken, would one day matter more than they could understand. The weeks that followed were full of preparation. The crispness of the mornings deepened into colder days, and the first frost made its appearance on the edges of the fields. Esther and Jacob spent each day working together, ensuring their home would be ready. But it was impossible to predict what was coming. No one in the community had expected the early snowstorm that swept in as October began. One evening the sky darkened unexpectedly, and a wind blew fiercely from the north, howling through the trees. By morning, snow had covered the land thick, heavy, and unrelenting. The wind continued its furious howl, cutting through the air with a sharpness that sent a chill deep into the bones. It was an early storm, one that no one had prepared for. It came without warning, leaving the community scrambling for shelter and warmth. Fires were stoked in homes, but the walls, built hastily for the warmer months, could not contain the heat. The cabins, though sturdy, were not meant for such intense cold. Esther stood at the window, watching the snow pile up in heavy drifts. The flakes fell relentlessly, covering the land in a blanket of white that showed no signs of letting up. Jacob came to stand beside her, his broad hand resting gently on her shoulder. "It's early," he said, his voice soft but filled with a quiet concern. "This might be just the beginning. The Lapp family had enough wood piled in their shed to keep the fire burning for a while, but Esther couldn't shake the feeling that something more was needed. The small things, the jars packed with care, the way they'd preserved every last potato and turnip, suddenly felt inadequate. The storm raged on, and soon, the world outside their door became a wilderness, unknown and unforgiving. The first day passed with little more than the steady sound of the wind rattling against the windows. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped to an unbearable low. Inside, the fire burned with a steady warmth, but the chill in the air lingered, creeping into every corner of the cabin. Jacob stoked the fire again, but even the warmth of the hearth could not take away the weight of the storm outside. As the hours dragged on, Esther and Jacob gathered in silence. The storm outside echoed their concerns. Would the food last? Would the warmth hold? In that moment, Esther felt a quiet resolve. They had prepared for this. The food they had carefully stored, the warmth they had nurtured with their own hands, it would be enough. The storm could rage all it wanted, but they had done everything they could to ensure their survival. And yet, as she glanced at the jars of food lined up in the cellar, she wondered if it would be enough for more than just them. Would it be enough to help their neighbors, too? Would they survive what was to come? As the storm continued through the night, it became clear that this wasn't just an ordinary winter storm. It was the beginning of something much more severe, a test of endurance, faith, and survival. By the time December arrived, the storm had not let up. It wasn't just the blizzards that came in waves, but the constant, cold, merciless, unrelenting. The snow piled deeper with each passing day, and the wind seemed to bite at every exposed inch of skin. As weeks passed, the quiet rhythms of daily life were replaced by the grim reality of survival. The railroads had stopped running. Neighbors who had taken their time to prepare those who had stored food, like Esther and Jacob, were faring better. But there was no escaping the bitter truth. Others were struggling. Esther's heart grew heavy as more families came knocking at their door. They were cold, hungry, and frightened. Some had barely enough to make it through the day. Their homes had grown cold as the firewood dwindled, their pantries emptying quicker than expected. Jacob helped when he could, offering firewood and whatever food they had left, but the storm had left everyone in a state of quiet desperation. On one particularly harsh evening, a man named Peter Johnson came to the Lapp's cabin. His face was pale, and his eyes hollow with exhaustion. He had 4 children with him, their faces pinched with cold and hunger. His wife, Alice, was terribly ill with pneumonia, and the bitter wind had made it nearly impossible to keep her warm. He had heard from a neighbor that the Lapps had enough food to spare, that they had been able to survive better than most, and he had come for help. Esther immediately recognized the look of defeat in his eyes. It was the same look she had seen in her own mirror before, when the weight of the world seemed too much to carry. Her heart ached as she opened the door wider, letting the cold night air slip into the warmth of the cabin. "Come in," she said softly. "We have enough for you. Come inside." As they entered, the warmth from the fire hit them all at once, but it was only temporary. Esther hurried to the kitchen, gathering what food she could. She ladled soup from the pot, warmed bread from the stove, and offered them all the warmth her heart could bear. Jacob made sure the children were settled by the fire, wrapped in blankets, and offered them hot milk. Peter, exhausted beyond words, collapsed into the chair by the hearth. "I didn't know what else to do," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My wife, my children." Esther could see the worry on his face, the helplessness that came from knowing there was only so much one could do when the elements turned against you. And though she had her own worries, her own family to protect, she found herself nodding. There was more than enough for them all. She had no idea how long the storm would last, but for now, they could survive together. Over the course of 3 days, the Johnson family stayed with the Lapps. The warmth of the fire never faltered, and the food, carefully preserved and stored in jars, was enough to see them through. Alice's condition slowly improved, and the children, once frail and shivering, began to regain their strength. On the 4th day, Peter stood up to leave, his face drawn but grateful. "I can't thank you enough," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We would not have made it through without your kindness." Esther smiled softly, placing a hand on his arm. "It's nothing, Peter. It's what we do for one another." As they left, Jacob stood beside Esther, watching them disappear into the snow. He didn't speak at first, but his words when they came were simple. "We could have turned them away, Esther, but we didn't." "No," she replied, her voice calm. "We did the right thing. It's not just about food. It's about keeping each other alive in every way we can." The days following the Johnson family's stay were filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. Winter had gripped Lancaster County tightly, and the Lapps were no strangers to its harshness. But what had begun as a test of survival had grown into something more profound. It was no longer just about getting through the storm, it was about the lessons they were learning along the way. Esther moved with an ease she hadn't known before. Every jar of food she touched seemed to carry more meaning now. Each preserved carrot, each jar of tomatoes, was a lifeline, a testament to their devotion. Her hands moved faster than before, working in tandem with Jacob's as they made their rounds, checking the firewood, tending to the garden, preparing for what would come next. But it was the quiet moments that spoke the loudest. Esther had always believed that it was the act of preparation that carried weight, the care taken in the small things. She had seen how something as simple as storing food properly could make the difference between survival and loss. She had seen how her faith had guided her through. But she never realized how much those small acts of care could change the lives of others too. One evening, as the wind howled outside, there was a knock at the door again. This time it was William Crawford, a neighbor who had once mocked Jacob for his slow, deliberate ways. William had been among the first to build his cabin quickly, with little thought for the long winter ahead. But his cabin had not fared well in the snow. His firewood had run out weeks ago, and his food supplies had dwindled to nothing. He had come seeking refuge, humbled and uncertain. When Jacob opened the door, William stood there, face drawn with exhaustion. "I've come to ask for help," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I was wrong, Jacob. I see that now." Jacob didn't hesitate. "Come in, William. We'll get you warm." Inside, Esther looked at William with quiet understanding. She had known this moment was coming, but she had no time for judgment. They had all been wrong at times, and now it was time to give. She shared what they had, as she had done for Peter Johnson and his family. As they sat by the fire, William spoke of his regret, of the mistakes he had made in rushing to build his cabin without preparing properly. "I thought I was being practical," he said, his voice heavy. "But now I see. Sometimes, it's the slow, deliberate work that saves us." Esther smiled softly, looking at Jacob as she spoke. "It's not about being right, William. It's about being prepared." And in that moment, something deeper than survival had been shared. A lesson had passed from one soul to another. The storm outside had not just tested their homes, but their hearts. And as winter continued its relentless march, the Lapps knew they had passed a test far greater than they had ever imagined. The storm that had ravaged Lancaster County eventually relented, but its impact lingered long after the winds had quieted. The spring sun warmed the earth once more, and the earth began to reveal the scars left behind. Yet, for the Lapps, there was a sense of quiet gratitude as they watched the land thaw. They had weathered the hardest winter anyone could remember, not just by their hands, but by the simple wisdom passed down through generations. As the days grew longer and the fields turned green again, the community began to rebuild. Those who had faltered, who had lost so much to the storms, now sought solace in the old ways. Neighbors who had once mocked Jacob's deliberate ways now came to him for advice. They needed to learn how to preserve what was left, how to prepare for another winter that might come too soon. Jacob, never one for pride, opened his door and his heart to those who sought help. His lessons were simple: trust the earth, trust the time it takes to care for it, and trust that faith in the process would provide. They worked together in the fields, as they had done for years, but now there was a renewed sense of purpose. Jacob's careful way of storing food, his insistence on taking time to preserve and prepare, became the new standard. It wasn't just a matter of survival. It was a matter of honoring the land, the earth's rhythm, and the gift of faith that guided them through. Esther watched as the lessons they had learned in those long months of winter took root in the community. The simple act of preservation, once viewed as unnecessary by many, had become the key to survival. It wasn't just the jars in the cellar or the firewood stacked high outside, it was the trust in the process, the quiet faith that if you gave enough time and care, you could weather any storm. Their home became a place of refuge for many, not just in the storm's wake but in the years to come. The Lapps had not just survived, they had become a quiet beacon of endurance, faith, and humility. As the months passed, the children grew, and Esther took on the task of teaching them what had been taught to her. She showed them how to preserve the vegetables, how to seal the jars with care, and how to honor the earth with the same reverence her grandmother had shown her. And as she did, Esther realized that these simple acts, the work, the faith, and the lessons passed from one generation to the next, would carry her family's legacy for years to come. One day, she hoped, her children would teach their children the same lessons. And so the cycle would continue, unbroken by time or change. The knowledge they had gained from hardship would become their strength, not just for survival, but for the quiet, enduring beauty of life itself. As spring blossomed into summer, the Lapps looked around at the abundance they had created, not just in the fields, but in the hearts of their neighbors. The storm had been fierce, but it had brought them all closer, and in that closeness they found the strength to face whatever the future held. Years passed, and Lancaster County slowly returned to its peaceful rhythm. The seasons came and went, as they always had, but the memories of that brutal winter never faded. The lessons of survival, faith, and community became more deeply ingrained in the people who had weathered it together. For some, the storm had been a turning point, a reminder that life could change in an instant. For others, it was a quiet awakening to the importance of preparation and care. Jacob and Esther continued their work, growing, older, but never slowing, in their commitment to the land and to each other. Their children, now young adults, had taken on responsibilities of their own, learning the value of the harvest and the quiet faith that guided their parents. The cabin, once a humble structure that had only served as a shelter from the storm, had become a symbol of endurance and hope. But the true test of their legacy came when the hard winter of 1880 finally passed into history. As the community rebuilt itself, a new generation took its place. And with that generation came a new kind of urgency. The world was changing, and not everyone understood the old ways. The simplicity and humility that had sustained them for so many years now seemed out of place in a world that was rapidly evolving. One day, as Esther walked through the fields with her children, she caught sight of a young man coming down the path. He was a stranger, and as he neared, Esther recognized him. He was the grandson of Peter Johnson, the same man she had helped during that long winter. He had come seeking more than just a story. He had come to learn. "I've heard about your family," the young man said, his eyes filled with admiration. "The way you survived, the way you lived. My grandfather always said that the Lapps taught him more than anyone could have ever taught him. I want to learn those lessons too." Esther smiled, her heart swelling with quiet pride. The lessons of the past, the wisdom she had inherited and passed on, were now being sought by those who needed them most. And in that moment, Esther knew that their legacy would continue. The storm might have come and gone, but the work, the faith, and the enduring strength of the Amish way of life would carry on for generations. By the time the second winter after the storm had arrived, the community of Lancaster County was well on its way to recovery. The harvests were bountiful once again, and the people had learned, perhaps for the first time, deep value of preparing for the unexpected. Esther, Jacob, and their children worked alongside neighbors who had once looked on with skepticism, now eager to embrace the old ways of preserving food and preparing for the winter. The storm of 1873 had left more than just physical scars on the land. It had revealed weaknesses in the way the community thought about survival, about reliance on the land, and on one another. Many families, who had barely made it through that winter, now saw the wisdom in Jacob's slow, deliberate methods. Esther's quiet teachings about food preservation were shared more frequently, and the lessons she had learned from her grandmother were now passed down to a new generation. But it wasn't just the preservation of food that had changed. The storm had forced people to reconsider what it truly meant to be a community. Neighbors had helped neighbors, not out of obligation, but out of a deep, shared understanding of the fragility of life. Those who had once turned a blind eye to the struggles of others now saw the importance of looking out for each other, of sharing what little they had in times of need. As spring began to stretch its arms across the land, the Lapps noticed something in their neighbors that hadn't been there before, a quiet humility and gratitude. There was a new understanding that survival wasn't just about one's own strength, but about the strength of the entire community. The storm had been a teacher, and its lessons were now etched into the hearts of everyone who had survived it. One afternoon, as Jacob and Esther worked in their garden, Jacob looked over at their children, now teenagers, who were helping to plant seeds for the next harvest. He felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that the values they had instilled in their family, the values of hard work, faith, and care for the earth, had taken root in the next generation. Esther, wiping her brow, turned to him. "It's been a hard few years, Jacob," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But I believe we've learned more than we ever could have imagined. We've learned that it's the simple things that keep us going, the quiet acts of care, the work we do, the faith we hold." Jacob nodded, his heart full. "It's true," he said. "The land teaches us, just as the storms do. It's not about surviving, it's about living in a way that honors all we've been given." And with that, they turned their attention back to the earth, knowing that they were not just tending to the land but to the future, planting seeds not just for the next crop, but for a way of life that would continue to endure. Years rolled on like the steady flow of a river. Lancaster County, with its rolling hills and wide-open fields, changed as the world around it did. The once unfamiliar ways of the Lapps became the standard for many in the community. Food preservation, slow and methodical, became a practice that others took up with pride, and the simple, humble ways that Esther and Jacob had lived by became the blueprint for future generations. By the time Esther had reached her mid-60s, her children had grown into strong, capable adults, each with families of their own. The Lapp family's farmhouse had been passed down from Jacob and Esther to their children, but the lessons they had taught about hard work, faith, and humility continued to echo through the walls of that old house and through every meal shared in the kitchen. Esther often sat by the window, watching her children and grandchildren work together in the fields. There was a peace that had settled in her heart, a peace that came from knowing that the hard lessons learned in the early years of their marriage had not been in vain. The work, the perseverance, the care, they had all paid off. One evening, as the sun set over the fields and the first chill of autumn began to settle in, Esther felt a quiet tug in her heart. It wasn't fear or sadness, but a deep sense of gratitude. She thought of the storms that had come and gone, of the hardships they had faced, and the ways they had met each challenge with strength and love. And yet, there was one thing that had remained constant: faith. It had been the thread that had tied them all together, the quiet strength that had seen them through the darkest of winters and the longest of seasons. Esther knew that it was not just their hands that had built their lives, but their hearts, their faith, and their unwavering belief in one another. As the night grew darker and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Jacob joined her by the window, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. They both looked out at the land, now bathed in the soft light of the moon. "I think we've done well, Esther," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. "We've built something lasting," Esther smiled, turning to him. "We've built more than just a home, Jacob. We've built a legacy, one that will last through generations." And as the years continued to pass, the Lapp family's story of survival, faith, and the quiet strength of love became a part of the land itself. A legacy of resilience and hope passed down through the seasons and through the generations, just as the earth continued to nourish them all year after year. As the years passed, Lancaster County returned to its gentle rhythms, the seasons unfolding in their familiar patterns. Yet, for all the peaceful flow of daily life, Esther never forgot the lessons the harsh winter of 1873 had taught them. That season had been a wake-up call, a reminder of just how fragile life could be when the land turned against them. But it also had become the foundation upon which her family's resilience had been built. Now, in the fall of 1889, the air was cooler than usual, a sharp reminder that winter was drawing near. Esther, now in her mid-60s, stood in the doorway of her home, looking out at the horizon where the sun began to dip behind the hills. The fields were quiet, the harvest done, and the work of preserving the food for the coming winter was nearly finished. But a part of her still held the weight of the past close to her heart. She knew the coming winter might not be as severe as the one of 1873, but the memories of that long, brutal storm had never quite left her. In the months leading up to this year's harvest, she had kept a steady eye on the weather patterns and, as always, had prepared with meticulous care. The cellar was full, the firewood stacked high, and the house was secure against the cold. But she couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that had settled in her chest. The land had been kind to them for many years, but the land could be unpredictable. As the winds began to pick up, Jacob, now in his 70s, joined her at the door. His gait had slowed over the years, but his presence was still strong, as steady and unwavering as it had always been. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder, sensing the weight of her thoughts. "Are you worried about the storm, Esther?" he asked softly. She nodded, her gaze never leaving the horizon. "I feel it coming," she said, her voice low. "It's as if the land itself is holding its breath." Jacob, ever the optimist, squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. "We've weathered storms before, my love, and we'll weather this one too." Esther smiled, but there was something deeper in her heart, a quiet awareness that the storm, whatever it might bring, would be yet another test of everything they had built together. The cold might come hard, the wind might howl, but as long as they stood together, as long as they had their faith, they would survive. They always had. That evening, as the wind began to howl outside, Jacob and Esther sat together in their small kitchen, their children and grandchildren gathered around the fire. They had built a life that was humble yet rich in its simplicity. The warmth of the fire, the laughter of their family, and the quiet rhythm of their work gave them peace, even in the face of the coming cold. Esther, her hands gently folded in her lap, looked at her family with quiet pride. "The storm will come," she said softly, "but we'll be ready. We always are." The winter of 1889 arrived with all the force that Esther had feared. The first snow came early, covering the land in a blanket of white. The winds howled through the night, and the temperatures plummeted far below what any of them had expected. It was the kind of storm that made even the most seasoned farmer uneasy. But the Lapps, ever prepared, took the first days of the storm with the calm confidence they had built over the years. As the days grew colder and longer, the family remained huddled in the warmth of their home. The wind raged outside, but inside, the hearth blazed, and the walls stood firm against the cold. Esther and Jacob's children, now adults, had their own homes nearby, but they came to visit frequently, bringing their children to sit by the fire, sharing meals, stories, and laughter. Though the storm was fierce, the food they had stored in the cellar and the firewood stacked high outside ensured that they would not go hungry or cold. The lesson of that long winter in 1873 had been well learned. The food, preserved with care and faith, would carry them through the hardest of times. And once again, the community of Lancaster County found themselves looking to the Lapps for guidance, for wisdom, and for strength. One day, as the snow piled high against the windows and the wind howled like a wild beast outside, Esther sat by the fire with her granddaughter, Susanna. The young girl, only 10 years old, had been listening to the stories Esther had told her over the years, the stories of survival, of faith, and of the humble lessons passed down through the generations. "Grandmother," Susanna said, her eyes wide with curiosity, "how did you know what to do? How did you know the storm was coming?" Esther smiled softly, her hands resting in her lap. "Sometimes, child, you don't know. You just feel it in your bones. The land speaks to you, if you listen carefully enough. And you prepare the best you can. The rest, well, the rest is in God's hands." As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Esther's mind drifted back to the early days of her marriage, to the long winters she and Jacob had faced together. Those winters had tested their strength, their faith, and their resolve. But they had made it through, not just because of their preparation, but because of their unshakable belief in each other and in the simple, steady work of their hands. She looked down at her granddaughter, who was now listening intently. "You see, Susanna," she continued, "the most important thing is not to fear the storm, it's to prepare for it. And when it comes, you stand strong, with faith and with love." The wind howled outside, but inside, the Lapp family sat together, their hearts filled with peace. Esther knew that the legacy of survival, of humility, and of love that she and Jacob had built would live on in the generations to come. The lessons they had learned would carry through, just as the seasons had. And as long as the Lapp family stood together, the storm would never truly defeat them.